Saw Jeff over here getting sympathy from everybody. I don't know. He had to sit over there by himself so there'd be a line that would form over there to see him. I told him he's just like our dog. We had to take our dog yesterday. Well, I guess 2 days ago. She had surgery on her ACL and her knee. I said, boy, you two are in the same boat. I should take her over and let her just hang out with you for the next 4 weeks. She's not allowed to be around any of the other dogs. And that's a tough thing to do. So, Sierra, I owe you an apology. See, on the 4th, I asked Sierra, I said, how was your vacation? And she said, it was good. I said, oh. I said, what time did you get back? She said, well, God, what'd you say, about 4 o'clock? Now, there was a whole group of them that went, and I said, well, that's weird because Mark made it back in time for church. I don't know what your fault was there that you couldn't get back in time, but Mark made it back in time for church. I don't know what the rest of the group was doing. But I told her I was just kidding. I was giving her a hard time. I said, I never miss church for vacation. Well, that said, we won't be here next week. We planned a last-minute vacation. We thought we could do it Monday through Saturday. But where we're flying into, there's just so many flights that go in and out of there. So we will not be here next week. But Eddie Mitchell will be here, and I know he'll do a great job. I'm not even concerned about that, so he'll be preaching next week. Walt Disney built an entire empire on make-believe and magic, on fantasy. And as children, we grow up living somewhere between that fantasy world and reality. If you think about it, we're always kind of dipping back and forth between a fantasy world and the reality. Partly I know that because when you're growing up, at least for me, I thought my dad was the toughest guy in the world. We would go to school and we would talk about my dad could beat your dad up. No, my dad's stronger than your dad. No, my dad's way meaner than your dad. These are actual conversations that we would have. I remember, this was before my dad was saved. I remember there was a guy in our neighborhood that was driving up and down the road speeding, and there was children that lived all through our neighborhood. And my dad ran out and told him to slow down. My dad didn't put up with that kind of stuff. Kids' safety came first. And the guy gave him a few gestures, swore at him a little bit, and peeled his tires out. So my dad went in the house, and I thought, surely he's not just giving up like that. Well, he had this long stick with 2 chains that come off the end of it, and it was on a swivel, and you swung it. And I thought, it's about to heat up in here. He went out there, and he gave that guy one more chance. He hollered at him, and he said, you slow down. He said, don't drive through like that. There's kids here. Well, once again, the guy gestured to my dad that he didn't care. He turned around, and when he came back through, man, he wound that thing up and whack, right on the car. And that's when I thought, yep, my dad's the meanest and strongest and baddest dude in the land. Now, didn't realize these were probably just a couple of teenagers, and, they were probably afraid of my dad anyway. But you grow up thinking these things because we don't know any better. Now, as you get a little bit older, you start to see your parents in a different light. And my dad went from being the strongest guy in the world, the toughest guy in the world, to this guy's an idiot. He doesn't know anything he's talking about. Where'd he get his education? This guy's a moron. It's just how it goes sometimes. Some of us idolize our parents, and then as we get older, we think, no, this guy's not who I thought he was. Then something miraculous happens. We have children. And all of a sudden, he becomes the smartest man we have ever known. Now, I don't know if my kids ever saw me as the toughest or if they saw me as the dumbest, but I know since Dallas has bought a house, he sure sees me as the smartest. I swear I'm over there all the time doing something because he wants to help. And you know what? As a father, I'm happy to do it. But we have this fantasy as children, and it also goes into what we think about church. We went to a Bible store this weekend, or this week, whatever it was, and I saw all the adventure Bibles. And it's all the children's literature and all the children's books. And it took me back to when I was in church, just like I said last week with Bible school. It takes me back and it makes me think of the things I was taught. And you know, as children, I don't know that we ever questioned anything we were being told in Sunday school. Why would we? The adults we trusted, God we loved, and so we believed everything and anything we were told. Now, if you went to a good church and you were being taught right stuff, you were being taught good stuff. But we would believe anything because as children, that's how we just behave. We think everything is right. But again, something happens as we get older. We start to look at those things and go, well, those stories were cute as kids, but they're just fairy tales. They're just good stories to give us an example of who God is, but they're not real. Just out of curiosity this week, I Googled Daniel in the Lion's Den because I love to always read what Wikipedia says. You know, Wikipedia is the foremost authority on everything. Just ask it, it'll tell you. And I Googled Lion's Den, Daniel in the Lion's Den, and it said, this is part of the folklore stories that have been gathered and collected to tell stories of people of the past. And they go on to let you know that these things never really happened. They were just stories to give examples of who God might be. And I thought, man, do they got it wrong. But that's the world, right? The world tells you these things can't be possible. These things can't be real. See, they know that we grow up on these stories. So as we get older, they try to tear us away from these things by telling us they're not real. These stories, they're just fake. Of course, my question for them is, what happens when you look up King Nebuchadnezzar? He's real. He was a real king of a real kingdom. How do you discount that? Well, they're just stories built around his kingdom, but they're not real. How do you know they're not real? See, there's something that happens when we get older. Maybe it's life, maybe it's people around us, maybe it's the things that we read, but they get us thinking that what we have been brought up on, what we have read in this book, well, it's just fairy tales, it's fake. Now, don't get me wrong, people think there's some good stories in here, but that's all there are, they're just good stories. They'll tell you that there's nothing in there that's concrete. There's no way to prove how any of it's real or not real. And it's so sad that we allow the world to spoil us on who God is. And we allow the world to spoil us on his word. I think it was it Charlie, was it you that said last week that someone says the Bible, there's some stuff in there that's good, but most of it's just made up or fake. Well, how's it a good book if that's the case? The other question I have is, if this book is just full of fantasy and stories, how is it still the most sought-after book in the world after over 2,000 years? Now, I know that in the 2000s, well, maybe earlier than that, I don't know when it started, but the Harry Potter series became one of the best-selling series of all time. It hasn't even come close to touching how many of these have been sold, nor will it ever. It's just not how it works. When you have a truth, when you have the truth of what Scripture is, it stands the test of time. It lasts forever. Nothing has ever outsold the Bible. Do you know it's on the New York Times bestseller list every single year? You know how most of those books get on that list? Their publishers pay for the rights for it to be put on that list. They pre-sell so many books so that they can get on that list when it comes out. God hasn't had to pre-sell one Bible to get it on that list. It's on that list because people are drawn to this book because of the truths that are in it. Well, Daniel in the Lion's Den is one of those stories that most people look at and say, I remember talking about that in Sunday school. Daniel apparently made some people mad. The king threw him in a lion's den. He survived. God was good. But for most people, that's all they know about the story. They know nothing more than that. If we look at the beginning of Daniel and we go through, Daniel starts to interpret dreams for the king and he finds favor. And then he brings his 3 friends along with him. Who are they? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know why that's so fun to say, but it just is. He brings these 3 guys along with him. They help him interpret these dreams. But then something happens in chapter 3. The king creates this idol and says everybody has to worship this idol. Well, there were some jealous people. Have you ever met jealous people before? You know, jealous people don't like it when you're happy, so they want to find a way to make you unhappy. They don't like it if you have power, so they want to find a way that you don't have any more power. Well, these astrologers, I'm sure they weren't too happy with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they went to the king and said, you know this statue you built that you said everybody has to bow down to? Well, these 3 jokers, these Jews, are not doing that. And we know what happens. The king gets aggravated, he gets mad, and he throws them into a fiery furnace. But you ever ask yourself, why wasn't Daniel included in that? Why wasn't Daniel one of the ones that was thrown in the fire? It's not because Daniel was bowing down and praising the statue. I'm sure of that. What's that? He's out of town. He was out of town on vacation. Or another possibility is those who were jealous knew that he had so much favor with the king that they didn't want to include him because they knew the king would never do anything to Daniel. Daniel was someone that he prized, someone that he looked after, someone that interpreted his dreams. So they couldn't include Daniel because then the king would never make an example of these 3 guys. So what he did was he said, hey, these 3 guys won't do what you're asking. And they throw him into the furnace. But Daniel wasn't a part of that. After that day, the king Nebuchadnezzar says, everybody now has to praise the one true God. But what happens after that? He's a typical king. He does wrong. You know, ego and power clouds our vision. And man, do kings have power. So do presidents. Look how all of our presidents are behaving. I mean, how far back do you want to go? They disobey God left and right. They do whatever they want. Well, we can just pretty much include anybody that lives at Washington, D.C. in that. They all want to do their own thing because ego and pride tells them they can do whatever they want. They don't answer to anyone. And eventually that's what happens. And God punishes King Nebuchadnezzar. But then his son takes over. Well, his son didn't make it near as long as he did because he had an even bigger ego. Even though he saw what happened with his father, he still went and did things he shouldn't have done. And now he has been removed from power as well. So now we get to chapter 6, where we're going to start. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces. And he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. In other words, he's appointing what we would look at as governors and mayors. He wants them to govern themselves locally. He wants them to rule over that. This is going to make it easier for him as a king. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers because of Daniel's great ability. The king made plans to place him over the entire kingdom. So here he is. He's on his 3rd king, King Darius. And once again, Daniel finds favor. And now he finds him in place of the whole kingdom. He's in charge of everything. Well, when that happens, when we get elevated to a position of favor, what's that bring out? Brings out all the jealousy, all the anger, all the fear of the unknown. And in verse 4 it says, then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. You know, there's a story in the New Testament that sounds very similar to that. There was this guy, Jesus, who came, and all the religious leaders couldn't stand him. They were jealous, they were fearful, they were angry. And they tried and tried to bring up charges on Jesus, and they just couldn't do it. They couldn't find any fault with him. Everywhere they went, Jesus pushed them back because there was nothing they could find. Well, that's what we're seeing here with Daniel. They couldn't find anything that he was doing wrong. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. So what are they going to do? They're going to use the one thing that Daniel will never concede on. They're going to use his religion against him. Now, if it only were that easy, they're not just going to go to the king and say, Daniel's religion's a problem. You need to take care of this. No, that's not what Satan does. Satan tricks people. Satan is sneaky. So what they do? The administrators and high officers went to the king and said, long live King Darius. So what they do? They stroke his ego first. Man, long live the king. You're a great guy. Smart, intelligent. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. So see what they're doing? They're setting it up. They're setting Daniel up here. And the king doesn't know it. Why? Because the king knew that Daniel's being set up, he would have never went along with it. But the king sees nothing wrong with this, because they're not even mentioning Daniel at this point. They said, give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to any divine or human except to you, your majesty, will be thrown in the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed. An official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. Why did he sign it? Power, ego. I mean, these men come in just stroking his ego, going, you're the greatest. You know, for the next 30 days, we should only pray to you. I mean, you're our king. Still no mention of Daniel. But see, this is what they had in mind all along, because they knew Daniel. They could find no fault in him. They knew that Daniel would never pray to the king. So they set this whole thing up. So what they do, they snuck around and went behind. You ever do that as a kid? You know, when I wanted someone to spend the night, I always brought them along with me when I asked my parents. Harder for them to say no if they're standing right next to me. How many did that? Yeah. Or I knew that my mother would never agree to this. My dad could care less. I'll go to my mom. She says no, and I say, okay. And then I go to my dad, and I said, you know, Mom doesn't think they should stay, but I don't really. You see a problem with that? I don't care if they stay. That's what I thought. I didn't think you'd care. And of course, then later, my mom and dad would get in a fight because my mom told me no, my dad told me yes. I didn't care. My friend was spending the night. I was sneaky. That's what these guys did. They went around the back door and said, hey, let's do this and let's sign into law, and it cannot be revoked. That's important, because what they're saying is, you can't change this now. This is for you. This is you. 30 days, we're going to pray to you. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with its windows open toward Jerusalem. Now, what I find interesting here is he didn't hide anything, because Daniel's giving God all the glory. Daniel just didn't go upstairs. He made sure the windows were open. I'm sure he prayed where everybody could see him. He did not care. Why? Why didn't he care? Because he knew he had God. And he knew that as long as he had God, he could do whatever he wanted, as long as it was within God's will. How many of us get scared when people give us ultimatums? Or we hide who we are because we don't want others to know? Not Daniel. He went home and knelt down and prayed as usual. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Now, that's what these officials wanted all along. They had set him up. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Again, still haven't brought up Daniel yet. They said, hey, remember that law that you signed? You remember that? Remember what we talked about? Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? So now they're confirming it before they ever say anything about Daniel. Yes, the king replied, that decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. You know, I almost feel sorry for the king here. He's being set up. He doesn't even know it. He has no idea what they're doing. He thinks they're just honoring him. And in reality, it has nothing to do with the king. But what did they do? They knew that if they stroked his ego, they could get him to do whatever they wanted. And that's what they did. They played on his ego. They wanted the king to stand next to them for this next part. Verse 13. Then they told the king, that man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. There it is. That's what they've been looking for this whole time. There's the setup. So this whole time, from verse 1 to verse 13, it's all about setting them up. And now they have finally told the king their plans. Hey, this Daniel guy, he's breaking all the rules. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. So see, you know that he had no intentions of ever doing this to Daniel, but they've backed him in a corner. What's a king going to do at this point? Does he do what he said he couldn't do, which was revoke his own law that's unrevocable? He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of his predicament. Sound familiar? Pontius Pilate didn't want to do what he did either. He tried to stay clear of it, but it kept getting thrown back at him. A lot of correlations here. In the evening, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law of the king signs can be changed. So now they're reinforcing it again. They're saying this can't be changed. You have no choice. So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown in the den of lions. The king said to him, and I wonder if he said this to him quietly or if he said it in front of everybody. But I have to think that he whispered this to Daniel. May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. He's cheering for him. He's hoping Daniel survives. This is not what he wanted for him. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles, so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue from the lions? Imagine his relief when Daniel answered, Long live the king. My God sent his angels to shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. You know, as adults, we have a hard time believing these stories, right? We think, how would a whole den full of lions just let that man sit there all night? This is where we stop having this imagination, this childlike thought process that God can be who he says he actually is. It's not a fairy tale, though. It's real. God is real. His miracles are real. I think sometimes we forget that miracles still happen today. You know what we call them? Coincidence. Doctors call it, I don't know what happened. Doctor says, I can't explain it. When you were here last, it was this big. Now I see nothing. I can't explain it. God's miracles are all around us. And I imagine doctors see more miracles than anybody else. Why? Because they're the ones always scratching their heads and going, I don't know what happened. You were dying, but now you're not. It was there clearly a week ago, but today it's gone. And you know what the world will say? Well, it was never there to begin with. It was a shadow. They misdiagnosed you. See, the world wants you to take that childlike thought process and they want you to tamper it down by saying those things aren't real. I have an excuse for everything. I can explain away every miracle that you give me. I don't need someone to explain away the miracles. I don't need someone from the world explaining to me how God works. I know how God works. God is a God of love, mercy. He's a God of miracles, and they still happen today. The biggest miracle that we sometimes seem to overlook is the ultimate healing, the ultimate miracle of going home to be with Him. Too often when someone passes away, others will say, well, why didn't God save them? Are you kidding? God saved them in the biggest way possible. They are no longer here. I don't know about you, but when I get to heaven, my back doesn't hurt. I don't have bills. I don't have a wife nagging at me 24/7. I don't. Feel like I can't believe he just said that. It's okay. I remain in trouble constantly. It's all right. But you know, when we get to heaven, none of this is going to matter. Not one bit of it. To be able to live with that much joy, to know that when I leave here, I go someplace better. That's a miracle in and of itself. That we can have life after this life. See, this life is just a trial. It's a trial run. Can we love Him or do we not want Him? It's simple. We have two choices. We can love God with all our heart. We can believe in His Word, believe in His miracles. We can trust in Him. Or we can throw it all away and say, I don't believe. It's our choice. Our time on this earth is very, very short. And God's only asking us one question. Do you believe me? Do you trust me? God doesn't send people to hell. They choose hell by not choosing God. Well, this king was overjoyed. In order that Daniel be lifted from the den, not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had miraculously accused Daniel. He had them thrown in the lion's den along with their wives and children. You know, I always feel bad for the wives and children. The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For He is the living God, and He will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and His rule will never end. He rescues and saves His people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. This is a man who just earlier in the chapter gave a decree that people bow down and worship him and pray to him. God takes everything. Everything in this world, whether it's evil, whether it's good, bad, it doesn't matter. God takes it and uses it for his own glory. Here's a king who was tricked into decreeing that these people do this. Had to throw a man that he liked, probably a man that he somewhat feared, because this was a man that had served 3 kings and done it well. He was a man who interpreted dreams. He knew Daniel was in connection with his own God. And yet he was tricked into doing this. But because all this happened, he now decrees across the whole land that everybody know who Daniel's God is. Doesn't just stay there with him. He makes sure that the whole kingdom and beyond knows who Daniel's God is. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. You know, I don't wish that my enemies be thrown into the lion's den. I wish that my enemies would come to know God. I wish that my enemies would stop attacking me and start loving God. The Old Testament, things were so much different before Jesus came. But God makes it a point that you're either living for him or living against him. See, we think that Daniel in the lion's den is this cute story about a man who goes into a den. You know, and you've seen the cartoons. He's tiptoeing around the lions as if it's a Bugs Bunny cartoon. You know, and he's, nobody's saying anything. They're all sleeping. But it wasn't a cute cartoon. It was a real man who was thrown in a real den of lions. But even the lions have to obey God. Because God said, you can't touch him. He's mine. And the lions had to obey because they know who their creator is. Isn't it a shame that with our intelligence, with our understanding, that sometimes we forget who our God is? Our God isn't a cute children's story. Our God is a God that did amazing miracles from the Old Testament to the New Testament and still today. Because our God is the one true living God. I don't know where everybody stands on their stories with God or their beliefs in what God can do, but I can tell you this. There's nothing my God can't do. And there was a time I might have forgotten that. You know, just like with my father, there was a time that I thought he didn't know much. And that coincided with the same time that I thought that God didn't know much either. How arrogant was that of me? God doesn't know anything. I'm not even sure God's real. But you know, when I found my heavenly Father, I found my real Father, and I found out they were both a little smarter than I thought they were. And God has not stopped showing me miracles ever since. God has not stopped working in my life even when I'm not 100% on board with what he's doing. Because it doesn't matter. Once we're saved by grace, once God loves us more than we love him always, but once we decide to love him back, there's nothing he won't do for you. There's nothing he won't do. Don't let the world tell you different. Don't let the world tell you that this is a cute children's story, but it's not to be believed. Don't let the world tell you that there's nothing to these things. Daniel was real. Nebuchadnezzar was real. The kingdom was real. I have no reason to believe the stories are not. These are not just fantasy stories. These are the stories of our God and how mighty he is. Let's pray.